Hi, everybody. My name is Anton. I'm one of the product managers at MuleSoft, the company that recently got acquired by Salesforce. And I'm very excited to be speaking to all of you today about how to create a massive adoption with your APIs. This presentation might contain some future-looking statements. So this is the statement that protects us from saying such things. And before we get into the presentation, let's first speak about APIs. Before I get started, how many of you knows what the API is? All right, so the vast majority. Good. You're in the right place. For those that don't know what the API is, I hope every one of you uses Salesforce. And Salesforce as a system has an API. Those APIs allow developers to build innovations on the top of the Salesforce system. And when you go to App Exchange and you look through all those applications that Salesforce has, majority of those applications build on top of APIs that harvest the value of the Salesforce platform. What we wanted to focus today is to speak of how can you design and build your APIs so they have success and they have value within your organization. And to get started, I wanted to kind of give you a quick overview of the companies that we work with and the challenges that they face. So imagine you have two systems in your enterprise. You have a database, you have a cloud system, and you want to build an API to abstract that information so then developers could start building something on top. It normally works within small companies that have a few systems on the back end. But what happens when we work with large customers is that we see that there's still a complexity on the back end. There's still a lot of systems that require that back end connectivity. And when you try to abstract everything that you have within your enterprise with a single API, you still have that spaghetti on the back end, which makes it very, very difficult to understand what's actually happening within your enterprise. And here's just another representation on how spaghetti could look like in something very familiar to us, right? Somebody who might be familiar with how IT works, right? Trying to find the right outlet for the right socket to plug. It's very, very difficult when you have hundreds of thousands of different systems. Here at MuleSoft, we believe that there is a better way of building and managing APIs and driving your digital initiatives within the company. And the way we think about it is that not necessarily you need to think on how to build an API as a one common abstract. The APIs is basically the glue within your application network. So as you have multiple systems within your enterprise, in order to be successful, you need to start thinking on how you can harvest value on the top of each one of those systems with the API on the top and the composite service on the back end. And in this presentation, what I really wanted to focus on is the three keys on how to make your APIs and API programs within your enterprise successful. So the first might sound very obvious, but the more customers we work with, the more we realize that some people forget of what's the business value, what's the actual outcomes they try to create with an API. And here's a really good quote from Kristen, who is the author and one of the API evangelists, that says, the most important thing, the very first thing that you need to know when you start building an API is the value that you create. And if you don't know why you have an API, you're most likely not going to succeed. Earlier this year, we've done a survey. We asked all our customers that we work with what are the goals, what are the values that they're trying to harvest and they're trying to create with an APIs. And what we found out is that if you look at the very top, there are things like increased productivity, increased innovation, increased engagement and collaboration. And all of it makes sense, right? When you have an API that exposes a piece of the information, a piece of knowledge that you have within your organization, it enables developers to build things faster, and it unlocks the potential and the data that they never had access before. And it kind of goes really well with the business models that we see out there. They're basically the three main pillars. They're internal APIs that generate indirect revenue within your organization. So for example, imagine you need to have data from another team to access. That team could build an API and expose that information so other teams could start accessing that information easily. Then there are partner and customer APIs that drive this shared revenue model. And Salesforce, again, is one of the great examples where there are so many different applications that you can find on AppExchange that uses Salesforce's API to create yet another value on the top of the Salesforce systems. And there are public APIs. And public APIs provide the direct revenue. One of the great examples that some of you might know, if you look to Google APIs, for example, the API for the image recognition, a developer could go upload an image, and the Google API will respond back with what does that image contain, right? So if you upload a picture of a dog, it will tell you that, hey, there's a dog on the picture. And the way Google monetizes on that API is that it charges based on the transactions that developers make the API calls towards that API. And what's really interesting is that when we work with the customers and developers that use our platform, is that the majority normally focus on that public API, and a lot of them start forget about what value they could create within their own enterprise by building the sets of reusable APIs and building blocks that enable their organization. So prioritizing the value add over the monetization is very, very important when you think of having a successful API program. Here's one of our customers that we work with, MIT, that was able to use our platform. One of the first projects that they worked on is they were trying to standardize a lot of different systems to speak the common language and create a common dictionary for all people. So students, professors, all the staff was abstracted out with the same API, which allow MIT to eliminate over 1 year of this duplicated work that was done previously before that API was made available to everybody. The key number 2, know your customer. Again, might sound pretty obvious, but what we really mean here is that don't just think of what your customer wants to have in that API. Challenge them and ask them why they want to have it. And the reason why this is important is when you think of this wrong approach that some of the customers, some of developers choose to pursue, is that they think if you build an API, the consumers, the customers will come. But there is a better approach with building an API with customers. And they will be the first users, the first developers that will drive success of that API forward. Let's take a look into one of the example projects that you might have within your organization that will focus on the improved invoicing. I'm not sure how many of you worked with SAP before and how many of you look into the API documentation for SAP. When I joined MuleSoft 4 years ago, one of my first projects was to actually build a lot of interesting integrations on top of different systems, and SAP was one of them. I didn't know what SAP was before, and all the complexity that was put into the API documentation was very difficult to understand. Half of the documentation is still written in German, right? And I don't speak German. It makes it very, very difficult to access that data. So when we speak about building APIs, we talk of how can you build a consumption-optimized API that focuses on a certain use case. And in this case, the company that we talk about want to build an invoice API that will optimize and standardize how you think of accessing this specific data within your enterprise. And what's really interesting is that as you build that single API for the invoicing on top of SAP, all the developers that want to build something on top don't really need to have an understanding of SAP system and don't really need to speak that API language or all that complexity that SAP hides. And the other thing which is also really interesting is that as you start thinking of what APIs you can find within your enterprise, you not necessarily need to think of which system contains those records. The only thing that you need to think about is what API should I call in order to get those invoices out. And what it allows you to do in this specific case, it allows you to build more APIs on top of it that could bring other systems together and provide documents and the billing information through the single API endpoint for your developers to access. The key number 3, treat your API as a product. What we mean by that, if you look into product managers and what knowledge you need to have, is that normally the product managers focus on these 3 pillars, right? This needs to be an understanding of the customer, of why customer wants to build a certain things. There needs to be an understanding of technology and limitations that you might have. And there also needs to be an understanding of a business. What is the business value you're trying to create with that specific API? And what we mean by API product managers, and how can you look into the overlap of all those domain expertise and how you can create a successful API that way. When you look into products have a life cycle, right? So before pushing things to production and having customers that actually use the product, we think through design. We need to prototype a lot of different concepts, work with the UX designers, validate those concepts with customers. And APIs should have the product lifecycle too. And what we mean by that is when you look through the API lifecycle, everything starts with basically very common terms, right? You need to design your API. You need to put the spec together that will define the schemas, that will define the objects that are available within your enterprise. As you define what the specification is like, you need to validate and prototype those APIs with the consumers. The next thing that you have to do is you need to start thinking on how would you take that specification that you have defined and validated with the consumers, how would you implement it to the backend systems that you have? How would you test it? How would you deploy it and manage that on the cloud? And how would you publish the API portals? How would you expose the documentation for that API so everybody else could discover and understand how to consume that API? And what's really exciting for me working here at MuleSoft is that Anypoint platform that we build is uniquely positioned to provide the tools that allow you to think of the APIs as a product, that have tools for the API design, whether you build those APIs in OS or RAML. We have tools that allow you to easily validate and prototype the APIs with the consumers, and thinking through the entire lifecycle of design, manage, and engage your consumers, all of that captured within the same platform. And the mindset that we want to see when we work with our customers, it's very similar when Apple introduced the first iPhone, right? There were a lot of different limitations, but there was always an app for that. You would always be able to find an application that will do X, Y, or Z. And the way we think of APIs and how they drive value within your organization, it's very similar. There's always an API for accessing data and building things on top of that data and innovating within your organization. This is a high-level picture of the Anypoint platform and all the tools and services that it contains. At the very, very high level, we provide lots of design tools that enable your developers to actually build integrations faster. Whether you're building an API, you're building an integration, integrating Salesforce with another system, we have a lot of tools that simplify on how to do so. The Management Center enables you to easily deploy those integrations or composite services to the cloud. And we have tools and clouds of our choice, but as well we provide developers to have a preference to deploy the integrations to Azure, AWS, and other clouds of preference. And then at the bottom, you can see the Mule runtime services and Mule runtime, which is the core. That's where the integrations and the composite services live. You can learn more about MuleSoft and what we do and how to build an API by signing up for the free trial or taking the quick start. So we have a developers.mulesoft community. We have user community with a lot of meetups that you can attend. We also have a lot of training. And at the third floor of this building, we have our own MuleSoft booth where you could actually have a hands-on experience on the Anypoint platform and learn what we do and how to build this API successfully. And with that, thank you very much.